Welcome back to the Dershow. Tonight we're going to talk about the Constitution, what's in it, what's not in it, and President Trump and what he said about it, when he was right about, what he was wrong about. I liked a lot of the things in his inaugural speech. I love the fact that he wants to do away with DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is, of course, a misnomer for lack of diversity, lack of equality, and exclusion. The thing that has been done more to destroy American universities than any single act since I started attending American universities 70 years ago. 70 years ago. That's the year I started college, 1955, 70 years ago. And when I went there, it was a pure meritocracy. You had to work your head off and you got to get good grades, and grades were blind. And if you got good grades, you got into a good law school and a good medical school. Not always. If you were Jewish, you weren't able to get into some medical schools, even in my day. But that changed. And we had meritocracy for many years. Then came DEI, the end of meritocracy. People should not be judged based on their merit. They should be judged based on the color of their skin and the history of their racial group and their current status of race and gender. Identity politics became the order of the day, and intersectionality, the world divided into oppressed and oppressors, and depending on which group you were in, determined how many rights you have. And Donald Trump said, I'm burying that. I'm digging a 6-foot hole and I'm putting it in, and I'm putting a tombstone on top of it. And I think that's terrific. And I support it 100%. And I told that to President Trump on numerous occasions when I have seen him. So I'm so glad he's ending that. And he also said he's going to end lawfare. And as you probably remember, I made a speech in front of him when he was president-elect at Mar-a-Lago, in which I called for the Republicans not to sink to the level of Democrats and not to reintroduce lawfare. And I saw the president, clapping and shaking his head. And I think he agreed with that. And then yesterday in his speech, he commented on it. I don't know whether he got the idea from my speech or he was going to do it himself anyway. I don't know, but I was really pleased with that. But there are a few problems. Number one, he said he was going to end birthright citizenship. I think birthright citizenship is a dumb idea. If I were writing a constitution, I don't think I would put birthright citizenship in the Constitution. But let me read to you what the Constitution says, and then you can make your decision as to whether it applies. 14th Amendment, Section 1, all persons born, there's no ambiguity about that word, or naturalized, we're talking about those that were born or naturalized in the United States, and here's the critical clause, and, not or, and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens. Okay, so if you get what are invidiously called anchor babies, I don't like that term, but babies who were born in the United States, the parents who have no connection to the United States, tourists coming in to ski, and the woman goes into labor early and has a baby, the baby never spends more than a week in the United States, goes back to wherever, France or anywhere else, lives life as a French citizen, but then at age 60 decides, well, maybe I'd like to move to the United States. I'm a citizen. Should that person be a citizen? Of course not. Of course not. Now, what does the Constitution mean? And subject to the jurisdiction thereof. Well, generally, if you're born in the United States and you are a citizen, there are laws that subject you to its jurisdiction. Just by being a citizen, you can be sued. You can be subject to criminal penalties that you probably couldn't be subject to if you weren't a citizen. For example, only a citizen can commit treason. If you're not a citizen, you can commit crimes which are the equivalent of treason, but being a traitor to your country requires that you be part of that country. To run for the presidency of the United States, you have to have been born in the United States and be a citizen. Now, subject to the jurisdiction may, however, be subject to congressional change. I can imagine Congress passing a statute that says, look, if you're born in the United States, but you don't spend any time here and you've been out of the country for 25 years, you are no longer subject to the jurisdiction of the United States. I think Congress can pass that law because the Constitution doesn't define what it means to be subject to the jurisdiction of the United States. I don't think a president can do that. I don't think a president can declare that a person who was born in the United States is no longer subject to its jurisdiction. Courts will ultimately decide that, but my best view, as somebody who studied the Constitution for a long time, is that at the very least it would take congressional legislation to make a person born in the United States a non-citizen by making that person not subject to the jurisdiction of the United States. Without congressional resolution to that effect, or law to that effect, I just don't see. I'm a pretty clever lawyer. I've made won a lot of cases interpreting the Constitution and often interpreting it in ways that are not obvious. And, I would put my brain to it if President Trump called and asked me to. I think I'd have to call him back and say, sorry, Mr. President, I can't figure out a way around this one. And so please send me letters and tell me why I'm wrong, and tell me why how a president, through an executive action, can declare a person born in the United States not to be a citizen. This raises the bigger issue of what can and can't be done under executive action. We believe and our Constitution is based on separation of powers, three co-equal branches of the government. And then the question is, what can the president do as the executive branch? He is the executive branch. He's the only branch of the government that resides in one person. The Chief Justice is not the judiciary. It's the Chief Justice and the Supreme Court. And obviously, the president of the Senate or the Speaker of the House, they're not the legislative branch. It's the entire Congress. But the president is the entire executive branch. He doesn't have to appoint anybody. He could govern alone. Of course, they do. The executive branch is enormous. Probably at this point, without a doubt, the largest branch. It's a lot bigger than the judiciary and a lot bigger than the legislative branch. But it's, the power has been divided. And there's this big debate over the unitary executive. Is the executive just the president? Or has Congress divided the executive into administrative agencies, et cetera, et cetera? Interesting constitutional issue. But the issue as it relates to executive orders is, there's a little historical precedent here. Remember, Thomas Jefferson campaigned in 1800 that the presidency was too powerful under Adams and Washington, and he, as an anti-federalist, was going to make sure that the president only did what Congress wanted him to do. He had a strong view that Congress makes the law, the president applies the law, and the presidency is a department of limited power, just like the judiciary is a department of limited power. So is, of course, the legislature. But what did Thomas Jefferson do shortly after he was elected on that premise? He went and he made a better deal than anything ever Donald Trump could ever possibly do. He bought Louisiana for nothing, almost as good as Alaska. I think it was 7 cents an acre in Alaska. I think maybe Louisiana purchased a little bit more, but it completed the country. It expanded the United States, and he got it from France. I'm sure that President Trump is looking at that example to think maybe he could do it to the Panama Canal. Maybe he could do it to Greenland. No. Greenland is an interesting country. I don't think Greenland should be under the control of Denmark. That's colonialism. The Danes had nothing to do with Greenland. Greenland was not populated by Danish people. It was populated by natives of Greenland, particular native tribes. And Greenland ought to be independent. And if it's independent and not subservient to Denmark, it could make treaties with the United States. And make a defense treaty with the United States, make treaties involving the natural resources. So, when Trump says it, it always raises eyebrows. But when you think about it a little, he has something of a point. He has something of a point on the Panama Canal too. It was a terrible deal that peanut farmer made. He wasn't a deal maker, President Carter. A terrible deal. At least he should have for the next 100 years or 200 or 500 years, given the United States free passage or lowest possible fee passage through the canal, and given the United States some control over who uses and doesn't use the canal. I don't know the exact facts about how much influence China now has over the canal, but surely that's a national security issue. And Trump is not he's not talking through his sleeve when he talks about the Panama Canal and Greenland. They're both reasonable things to talk about, and Trump's policy is to start talking about them in unreasonable ways as a negotiating posture. And then when he gets to the negotiating table, he becomes tough, but more reasonable. I suspect that's what we're going to see. I suspect at the end of 4 years, the status of Greenland, the status of the Panama Canal might be a little different than they are today. I don't think we're going to use military force to go in and occupy the canal or go try to take over Greenland. That's not going to happen. But it wouldn't surprise me if there was some differences in the status of both of those very, very, very important countries, the Panama for its location and Greenland both for its location and its natural resources. But, the Constitution doesn't mention executive powers, executive statements, executive announcements, executive authorities. All administrations have abused that power. I guess Obama, worst of all, when he made a treaty with Iran about limiting their nuclear capacity, but he forgot to have it ratified by 2/3 of the Senate, which is required by the Constitution. Nothing ambiguous about it, except that Obama said it's not a treaty. It may look like a treaty. It may walk like a treaty. It may quack like a treaty, but it's not a treaty because I say it's not a treaty. And the result of that was that as soon as Trump came in, he rescinded it. If it's not a treaty, if it's just an executive act, then the next president can rescind it and do whatever he wants with it. So calling something an executive action and not passing it through the legislature is a double-edged sword. It gives you enormous power while you're president and absolutely no power when you're no longer president. If you want extraordinary power, you pass a constitutional amendment. That hardly ever can be rescinded. It's only happened once. Or you pass legislation, which can be rescinded, but only by the legislature. So we're gonna see how that all comes down, and we're gonna see what other authority is being challenged. The authority relating to the delay of TikTok. That's going to raise questions. There's going to be lawsuits. Already there are lawsuits, I think 18 of them, against the Birthright statement, and they'll win. Those lawsuits will win. The job of a lawyer is to predict, in fact, what the courts will do, and I'm pretty good at that. And I predict the courts will not uphold a presidential statement undoing the 14th Amendment's clear description that a person born in the United States and subject to its jurisdiction is automatically a citizen, even if he was spent only 10 hours in the United States from the moment of birth to the moment the woman leaves the hospital and gets on the airplane. So we'll see. The president probably did more in one day than any president in history, pardoned and commuted lots of sentences, including, we think, we haven't gotten official notification of my law student who went into the Capitol building, having been waved in by the police, committed no act of violence. So almost certainly comes within the category of people that would be a pardon, and maybe he can now get his law degree back. He's a great guy and will be a great lawyer. He's done, in the meantime, he's in business helping people and taking care of his family. So I wish him well, and I wish well all the people who have been pardoned and commuted. There's no law when it comes to pardon. There's no criteria set out in the Constitution. It's not like impeachment, treason, bribery, other high crimes and misdemeanors. All the Constitution says the president, shall have the pardon power. It doesn't use those words, but pardon all offenses committed against the United States. So then, the question comes up, what about an offense not yet committed against the United States? Can a president pardon friends, relatives, as Joe Biden did, who have not been investigated, not been indicted, not been arrested, on the theory that maybe they will be at some point in the future? And the answer is clear: no one knows. The framers never thought about that, and the pardon power seems to be pretty absolute. So I think that the courts will not undo the pardons given by the President Biden. Should he have given those pardons? I don't think so. Should he have pardoned his son? I understand pardoning your son. What he shouldn't have done is said he wasn't going to pardon his son and then pardon his son. But I understand that. But the son, after all, was already convicted of two offenses against the United States. So there's legitimacy in pardoning for that. But his brother, Fauci, no matter how hard I search, I can't find a crime committed by Fauci. Maybe Alvin Bragg could. He invents crimes. He makes them up. But he has no motive to do that because Fauci and he come from the same. I don't even know if Fauci's a Democrat. I just assume he is. But he's served presidents both who were Democrats and Republicans. Fauci grew up in Brooklyn, not too far from me. He was apparently a very good basketball player for his Catholic high school. We used to play against Catholic high schools. But he was a little younger than me, so I never played against him. But probably a Democrat. Everybody growing up in Brooklyn in my day was a Democrat. You were either a Democrat, a liberal, a progressive, Labor Party, Vegetarian Party, and then the Communist Party, and then below that was Republican Party. There were no Republicans in Brooklyn when I grew up, so I suspect Fauci was a Democrat growing up. I don't know, maybe he didn't get involved in political issues once he became the great doctor that he was. But you can't find a crime that he committed. People will argue about whether he was right or wrong, but he acted in what he believed was the best interest of the country. Many people think he was a hero for saving lives. Some people think he was not because he went too far in restricting liberty. I wrote a book about it. I wrote a book about everything, so don't be surprised that I wrote a book about that, about vaccine mandates, which I'm ambivalent about. So those pardons were not, I think, particularly justified, but they're constitutionally not challengeable. What about the president's pardons? He comes into office, and even before he gets to the White House, he's sitting there, he's signing these things away, he's throwing his pens, and giving people souvenirs. And he didn't sign the pardons there. He went back to the Oval Office to sign the pardons. And I don't think he's signed them all yet. I think he's just made a statement about who he's going to pardon. I think he has to probably sign individual certificates. I have a couple of them from 4 years back when he's pardoned and commuted some of my old clients back in 2021, January 2021. And I have copies of the, hand signed document giving the pardon. So until he does that, the pardon isn't official, but he's indicated that he's going to give pardons. Now, Vance, the vice president, said he shouldn't give pardons to people who have hurt other people. And I think in his list, he listed people who he was not giving a pardon to, but he was giving commutations to. And, I think you have to do it on a case-by-case basis, or at least a category-by-category basis. Again, no constitutional challenges are permissible, but policy challenges are permissible. President Clinton pardoned Mark Rich at the end of his term, and there was a lot of criticism about that because Mark Rich's wife, former wife it was, had made contributions to the Clinton Library. I was one of Mark Rich's lawyers. And he never, even though he got a pardon, was never able to set foot in the United States. He couldn't even visit a child's grave. A child of his died. Because he was afraid if he came to the United States, even though he was pardoned, he'd be subpoenaed in front of Congress and asked to testify about the circumstances of the pardon. I have no reason to believe that there were any circumstances that were illegal regarding the pardon. But obviously he was advised, I was not his lawyer at that point, but advised by his then lawyers not to come to the United States. But the pardon power is an unusual power. It's one of the few things that we borrowed directly from the country we rebelled against, from Great Britain. In Great Britain, the king had the plenary authority to pardon anyone. And, there's a big debate going on now. Do you have to accept the pardon? Don't you have to accept the pardon? There were two Supreme Court decisions, one called Perovich and then a bunch of other cases, and they're completely inconsistent. One of them from about 1915 says, no, if you accept a pardon, essentially you're admitting guilt. And then the other one, written by Oliver Wendell Holmes about 10, 12 years later, says, no, you have no right to reject a commutation. Presumably, you have no right to reject a pardon. It's an act of government giving you a pardon. And if you get a pardon, it's, like getting a communicable disease. You can't just say, I reject it. And if you have a pardon, whether you have accepted it or rejected it, you can't be prosecuted. And if you can't be prosecuted, you've lost your Fifth Amendment right. And let me tell you that the Biden family members and friends who were giving pardons are now perfectly susceptible to not a contagious disease, but to a subpoena from Congress, which may be worse. And they can't go in front of Congress and say, Your Honors, ladies and gentlemen, Congress, congressmen, congresswomen, we refuse to answer on the grounds that it might tend to incriminate me. That's over. If you're vulnerable to a state prosecution, maybe, but I think these are all federal. So I think maybe President Biden didn't do a great service to his brother. He said one of the reasons he was doing it was to spare them the expense and inconvenience of having lawyers. We are expensive and inconvenient, we lawyers. But he didn't succeed in doing that, because if you get a subpoena from Congress, you darn well better get a lawyer, and a good one. And a good one is often an expensive one. So we'll see if there are going to be congressional hearings or not. All right. Let's get some questions. Some of the questions have to do with that exactly. Biden didn't pardon himself. Interesting. He didn't pardon himself. So theoretically, could he still be prosecuted? And then his pardoned family members will have to testify against him. It's interesting. The problem is the Supreme Court also decided the immunity case, which Biden opposed and all the Democrats opposed. But under that immunity, Biden almost certainly could not be prosecuted. Not because he wasn't pardoned, but because even if he did commit any crimes, and I don't see any crimes that he committed, but even if he did, he has immunity, unless certain exceptions were not met. I'm not aware of what they are, but interesting to see what you think, what your letters say about that. Doesn't this open the door for any president to appoint someone to commit federal crimes, money laundering, etc., and then pardon them at the end of the term? That's interesting. If the president appoints someone to commit federal crimes, he's an accessory to those crimes. He's a co-conspirator, so he could be indicted unless he has immunity. The relationship between immunity, pardons, the Supreme Court dealt with that relationship in the Perovich case and some other cases as well. But these relationships are unclear. Immunity is not in the Constitution, and pardons are in the Constitution, but the criteria for pardons and the implications for pardons are not in the Constitution. Okay. Professor, now that Biden has pardoned Fauci, is it possible for state AGs to prosecute Fauci for COVID deaths in their states? Of course not. It's technically possible if you can prove he committed a crime in the state, but how is he responsible for deaths in their states? The argument against Fauci is that he was too careful is that he denied people liberty in his efforts to try to reduce the amount of death. And, many people think he succeeded in that regard, maybe at too high a cost of liberty. But again, let's never confuse policy differences with criminal behavior. That's exactly what the Democrats did with Trump, and what Bragg did, and what Letitia James did. So let's not make the same mistake. As I said, I made a speech in front of the president, and I think he seemed to have agreed with my conclusion, but I would never put words in his mouth. So let's see what happens. Okay. Please, Mr. Dershowitz, tell us about the legality of blanket pardons, including a pardon for unknown and uncharged crimes. I do not believe they will hold up against the Constitution. Well, you're wrong. They will. As you know, the only real example we have of that is President Ford pardoning President Nixon. Now, President Nixon hadn't been indicted or prosecuted, certainly not convicted, but he was being investigated. And we know the crimes that he was being investigated for and was pardoned about. The Biden thing is much, much broader. It goes back to, I think, it goes back to 2014, well beyond the statute of limitations. I think it was just designed to be symbolic, but I think it was a big mistake to do that. If he was going to do it, he should do it in a narrow way, and I think it would have been better if he hadn't done it at all. Look, pardons are seen as the antidote to lawfare. If we didn't have as much lawfare, we wouldn't have as many pardons. If we can get through the next 4 years without lawfare, and President Trump has said he, in his inaugural address, wants to see an end to lawfare, I'd love to see that. I coined the term. Happy to see it disappear off the face of the earth. I don't need it on my tombstone or in Bartlett's quotations, lawfare. But if we see an end of lawfare, we'll see an end to the promiscuous and broad-based use of pardons. Pardons are the antidote to lawfare. They're not a complete antidote because they don't cover state crimes, and we see that now with President Trump still being called a convicted felon. He's not a convicted felon. Anybody who calls him a convicted felon, I say, state the crime. What's the felony? Nobody can state it. You can't state it. There is no crime. It would take me the rest of the hour just to describe what people who think he's guilty of think he's guilty of. But, you can't turn an expired misdemeanor into a felony by giving a jury multiple choice as to what was in his head when he committed the non-misdemeanor. It's the best I can do in describing it, and it's laughable. So, we have a lot of concerns about these parts. This is an interesting one. Remember that Biden on the way out quoted the eminent constitutional objective authority, my former colleague Lawrence Tribe, as saying, well, the Equal Rights Amendment has already been passed. So you didn't know that. You didn't notice that it passed. You miscounted. You forgot about this fact or that fact. No. The archivist is right. There is no Equal Rights Amendment. There should be. I would be very happy to have an Equal Rights Amendment. But by the way, this woman who wrote to me wouldn't be. As a woman, I don't want an ERA. I don't want to be drafted in the military. Well, too bad. Without an ERA, you can be drafted into the military, or with it, you can be drafted into the military. There'd be nothing wrong with Congress if it reinstates the drafting women. They should do that. Now, there have to be exceptions, many exceptions, and more exceptions for women. And they can't be stated in neutral terms because men can't get pregnant. But women should be drafted in the Israeli army. They draft women. I'm sure many other armies draft women. In the Israeli army, by the way, the top gun in the Air Force for years was a woman. Women are just as capable of flying aircraft, because flying aircraft is not a physical act. It's an intellectual act. When you're flying an airplane, you're flying a computer. And I know I went to the Israeli Air Force and met with these incredible women pilots who were, some of them better, some of them just as good. I agree with the Secretary of Defense designee's statement. As long as you don't reduce standards, you have to have the same rules, and you don't need an Equal Rights Amendment for that. So, we live in interesting times. It's a good time to be a lawyer and a good time, I hope, to be an American, regardless of who you voted for. Let everybody wish for 4 great years for this president. Let everybody support the president of the United States, no matter who the president is, no matter what party the president's from. We all wish the president well, and we wish him and the country 4 years of great success. Yesterday was a wonderful day, a combination of Martin Luther King Day and transfer of government day. We saw democracy at work. I can't imagine how hard Donald Trump worked from early in the morning until way, way late at night, going to these galas and things. And so I wish the country well, and I wish that the next 4 years are the best 4 years in our history. See you tomorrow.